All in Sports Network. We love sports.
It is Wednesday, November 27th, and this is your daily fix for all things Texas Longhorns right here on All In Horns. I'm Tanner Carlson along with Jake Jimerson. This is brought to you by Rogue Sports Network, and today we've got a very special episode for you. This is our reaction to the college football playoffs. They have just announced this. This has been recorded on a Tuesday night. This will air Wednesday afternoon for everybody, and we will break down the rankings, where we think teams might be too high, where we think teams might be too low, and then we will look at the projected playoff standings as they are today and kind of break down what the matchups would look like, Texas's road to the national championship, and also what kind of has to happen moving forward this week in college football in terms of tiebreakers. I know there is an absolutely absurd situation and tie-breaking scenario in the Big 12 right now that we will touch on. And so as we move forward, we will go ahead and put up the rankings right now as they stand Tuesday night. This is what the top 25 looks like according to the College Football Playoff Committee.
Yeah, and I don't know about you, but what stands out to me first is Alabama still being right on the cusp of being in with losses to Vanderbilt and Auburn.
They're the second team out, according to the College Football Playoff. Clemson would be that first team out. Bama would be the second team out. And then right now, I mean, honestly, you're looking at Ole Miss and South Carolina at 14-15.
Yeah, I mean, they all still feel very alive. If you're South Carolina, you have to still feel like you're in this. You're going to need a lot of help if you're South Carolina, but still there's just so many possibilities from this point that can still shake things up. A&M is a team that could certainly mess things up because about the only way they're going to get in is by winning the SEC title. If they did that, that would throw a wrench in a lot of things because that would be a for sure 3-loss team getting in. Also, would Georgia get in with 3 losses? There's a lot of interesting possibilities out of this, and I'm curious of your kind of initial reactions of, it's hard to say of what will this look like for Texas, because for them to be where they're at right now, that's going to require them beating A&M and Georgia back to back. And I just don't even know if there's a point of discussing what this is going to look like if they were in this exact seed. But it's just more interesting to see, to me, Indiana still being in it, SMU finally getting some respect, Clemson coming out of nowhere, what's going to happen out of the ACC, and then Alabama looming large. That just really bothers me.
There's an Alabama shadow. Now, Jake, if we're going to be talking about on the topic of Alabama, who if not Bama?
I mean, you could give one of these Big 12 2-loss teams more love. You could give, I would probably give Ole Miss more love than Alabama. I would probably give South Carolina more love than Alabama, though they did lose to Alabama, but that was at Alabama. It was like a 2-point game. And if you factor in home field based off how sports books do, that would be pretty much a dead even game on a neutral field. When you consider that result.
Can I throw this out there without, I feel like I might get a lot of hate for this. What about Arizona State and Texas A&M being above Ole Miss and Bama?
I don't think Texas. I don't think Arizona State.
They're 2-loss teams, and they have a chance to represent their conference in a championship game where those 3 other schools ahead of them do not even have a chance to represent their conference in a conference championship game.
Yeah, I would probably have Bama behind A&M, honestly, which feels kind of weird to say, but you got to be punished for losing to Vanderbilt and Auburn. And to me, what this also tells me with Bama only dropping to 13, Oklahoma and Vanderbilt. The only thing I'll say about Texas's position with Alabama dropping as little as they did with losing to OU in the way they did, there's very little possibility of Texas falling out of this playoff.
If Texas lose, right. So that's kind of my grandioso overall consensus on this when it comes to Texas. I would almost I'd almost venture to say it's 100% that Texas is going to be in the 12-team playoff, win or lose, come Saturday.
I think most the like predicting models that are out there have Texas at like 97% plus. I
Yeah.
think the only way they want to get in is if they got embarrassed, unlike we've ever seen.
And then
From Texas against A&M.
And if it was like a Florida State situation where Quinn Ewers got hurt, Arch got hurt, and you're riding into a 12-team playoff with Trey Owens as your starting quarterback or something just detrimentally like chaotic happening.
Yeah, I think that's the only way they're not in, because if Bama's only going to drop, what were they, like 8th or 7th? What were they last week?
Yeah, it's that's a great question. I think they were 7. Maybe 9. Maybe they were 9. I don't know, 7 or 9, something along those lines. I don't think they were ahead of Tennessee.
Bama was number 7 last week. They were ahead of Tennessee, which that in itself I don't really like, because that game was played and Tennessee did win that by more than just a couple points.
Yeah.
But so you had Bama only falling from 7 to 13 with getting absolutely embarrassed by a team that wasn't even bowl eligible yet.
And here's the thing too, is South Carolina nearly beat Alabama, and or they're 2 spots behind them. But Jake, there's also a situation here where Tulane is sneaking up to be a conference champion. And if chaos ensues in the Big 12 as an entire conference could be left out. I don't think that is Jake, it's the top,
champion can't.
It's the top 5 conference champions.
Oh, yes, you're right.
It is the top 5 conference champions, not the top 4 power conferences get an automatic bid. It is the top 5 conference champions. So if chaos ensues, where say Arizona State drops or a BYU drops and they're ranked behind Tulane and Boise State both win their conferences, you might see a playoff scenario play out to where there isn't a Big 12 team represented whatsoever. Now, that's, again, all chaos ensues because, Jake, the Big 12 currently, they have a 9-team tie-breaking scenario right now headed into the final week of the season.
And also, don't forget, UNLV is still sitting here. They're going to play Boise State for the conference title. If UNLV beats a Boise State, where does Boise State fall? Where does UNLV go? Where does
Boise
Tulane
State's
end
done
up?
For, right. Yeah. So Boise State would be done for in that scenario. They would not be getting in. And I think Tulane probably gets that final spot into the playoffs.
And I don't think I would rather see Boise State or UNLV in that final spot. We got to see Tulane play 2 teams that were a higher caliber, and they lost both those games. And I wouldn't put them in over Boise State if Boise State lost, because Boise State would have a loss to Oregon by 1 possession on the road, and then a loss to UNLV in a conference title game, who's I would probably have above Tulane right now, especially when you consider when UNLV lost their games. It was right around that time where kind of madness ensued for their program, losing their starting quarterback, losing one of their top running backs, who decided to do that redshirt transfer portal option. And yet they've been able to recover and have been pretty dominant since then. Tulane is probably my biggest worry out of this, because I don't want to see them in the playoff. I think they'll just get blown out. I have at least seen Boise State play against top competition and actually compete. Tulane has played 2 middling to lower tier power conference teams and lost both of them.
Now, to make that argument, just counterpoint, SMU, Indiana.
Yeah, I don't have a great argument for SMU. I mean, SMU's going to have a chance to win their conference. I think SMU's going to have to win the ACC title game to get in, honestly. I'd be surprised if they made it with losing. And I think Indiana's just in.
So is there a scenario? I agree with Indiana. They beat Purdue. I believe they're in. There'd be no argument in dropping them down.
They're not losing to Purdue,
right? If they beat a Purdue, so you can go ahead and mark Indiana in as well. I agree. Jake, is there a scenario now? the conference champion or the conference committee, the playoff committee has come out and said now they changed their tune a little bit tonight because I think they see the tie-breaking scenario happening in the Big 12. They see it with where there's a possible 2 G5 conference championship winners that sneak in and maybe not a Big 12. I think they're kind of backtracking a little bit, at least the hint of it of we're not going to punish you for losing a conference championship game.
But
now,
saying
I think
that, what does that mean? Because
right.
A&M is not in right now. Would A&M really jump from number 20 into the top 11 is where you essentially have to be just for beating Texas at home? So
Yeah.
what do you mean by not going to punish? Because if you're not already going to be in it to begin with, and then you lose in the conference championship game of an SEC title game, not punishing them could mean not putting them in.
Right. And then, exactly. So now you're going to go ahead and you're going to have Texas and Tennessee, 2 SEC teams that did not make the conference championship in the playoffs, and you're going to keep A&M out. Like,
yeah, because
you
A&M lost a non-conference game.
Yeah,
at home.
And you can't. So, but this whole not going to punish you if SMU plays Miami in the ACC championship game. If SMU loses that game to Miami, are they not going to jump? Or is Clemson not going to sneak in there? Like what are you? What is like that?
Let me ask you this.
I think that's where there's a big kind of issue with where. Here's going to be the great thing about this at the end of the day. And I know you've got a question. Please keep it. Don't forget it. I think the discussion is going to be afterwards. When it's all said and done, the season's over, and we kind of reevaluate how this thing is going to be structured. This is year one. This is kind of a trial year. We're going to know a lot of issues and a lot of mistakes with this playoff system. And hopefully they kind of restructure it. They redesign it, and they make it to where they see the glaring holes in this kind of first year, and they go ahead and implement some changes even within this contract kind of 4-year span of what they're trying out.
Well, and I think conferences are going to have to look at their tiebreaker rules and probably figure it out, probably figure out a better way to have balanced schedules. You're going to have to base schedules probably somewhat based off prior year results. I think that's going to be the only way to do it. Kind of like an NFL does it in these divisionless conferences, which is pretty much all of them that are the power conferences, at least. Those are things that stick out to me that still involve college football playoff impact, but are on the conference side of things where changes might have to come, because we've talked about the balance of schedules in the SEC this year being completely out of whack. And I think that's something that probably needs to be fixed moving forward. And that goes for kind of every conference. But my question for you is, who in this top 12 is in the playoff as of right now, in your opinion, no matter what happens next week?
Oregon, Ohio State, Texas, Penn State. No matter what happens, if Indiana loses to Purdue, they're out. So I would say
Is Notre Dame? They play USC.
No, if USC beats Notre Dame, they're liable to fall out of the top 12, in my opinion. And I think Georgia might have stamped their way in being in the SEC championship game.
I think just doing the math, right? Like Bama was at 7 last week. They fell to 13, losing to OU. So they were willing to drop Bama. What is it? 6 spots.
Six spots.
For losing at OU. I think Notre Dame would lose probably at least 7 spots. They're going to punish them harder than Bama because Bama's just getting name recognition.
Well, so yes. And then also Notre Dame doesn't have a conference to fall back on, and they don't have a championship game to win to make up for that loss. Say they do lose to USC, and they would have 2 losses to a mid-level, mediocre, barely bowl eligible USC team if USC wins, and then a Northern Illinois team who it's inexcusable to have that loss at home.
Yeah, it's the worst loss out of any team in this probably entire list of top 25 teams.
Agreed.
And so just doing that math is why I also think Texas is locked in, because there's just no way they're going to drop them 9 spots for losing to a ranked opponent on the road. I would be floored if they did that. If they did that, it tells me they shouldn't have had Texas at 3 right now.
So that's a really good point. And so yeah, Jake, I think if Tennessee loses to a Vanderbilt, I think they're on the outside looking in, and that would probably mean a Clemson, or the way they have it ranked currently, who knows, an Alabama jump in for them. But yeah, it would have to take some pretty heavy chaos. I think the ACC is interesting to me, where they have the 6, 9, and 12 teams. I don't think any of those teams are locked.
No, because if Miami could lose to Syracuse, and then they might not even they're not locked into the ACC title game. Only SMU is.
Right.
And you feel like the best case scenario for the ACC is Miami beats Syracuse. They get into the title game, and then them and SMU have a really close game, and both of them get in. That to me is, I don't think the ACC is going to get all three of these schools in. I think they're only going to get two at most, and potentially one, depending, because let's say Miami loses to Syracuse, Clemson loses to SMU in the title game. I don't care what they said about not punishing teams. They're not going to put in Clemson. They're not going to put in Miami, depending what else happens. If a Tennessee loses to a Vanderbilt, if a Georgia loses to a Georgia Tech, by the way, that's worth mentioning. What happens if they're locked into the SEC title game?
True.
What happens if they lose to Georgia Tech?
No
game is in hand, and Georgia Tech isn't just terrible.
Georgia Tech beat Miami, and Miami's ranked ahead Georgia. Now, okay, so should Miami be ranked ahead Georgia? No, not in my opinion. I don't think Miami's a better team than Georgia. Now, you could argue record, but I don't think Miami's a better team than Georgia.
Georgia to me is the exception when it comes this season, not just because their name. They are the exception within this season for being ranked as high as they are with 2 losses, and you could argue them over Miami. You could probably argue them over Notre Dame as well. And the reason why is they have actually played the number 1 schedule in the entire country. Yeah. And strength of schedule does matter. It's not everything, but it does matter. And to me, it matters when you're comparing them to like a Miami who struggled mightily with a terrible schedule. And you have Georgia who's just played murderer's row and has come out alive from it somehow.
Yeah. And so I would agree. I would agree with everything you just said there. Jake, let's take a quick look at the Big 12. I don't even know. I'm not going to go out and go out of my way to try and explain the tie-breaking scenario. I think it would just be word vomit and jumbled, mumbled mess that no one's going to understand and follow anyway. I will say this much. There is a 9-team playoff scenario to where 9 teams are still capable of making the playoffs. Well, not true. Not entirely true. If a Baylor ends up sneaking in somehow, some way, playing against a TCU somehow, some way in the Big 12 championship, yes, both those 2 teams are still eligible for the Big 12 championship. They would not finish as the top 5 ranked team. And so that's where you're probably looking at where the Big 12 is not representing in the conference or in the playoffs. I do think, Jake, we would have to see. Right now, currently, Arizona sits at that 12th spot ahead of Tulane. If Arizona runs the table, they're good. I think if Iowa State runs the table, I think they still jump Tulane. I think if BYU runs the table, I think they also jump Tulane and would be at that 12th spot. Where do we get to a point, whether it's Kansas State or Colorado, say they come out on top in the Big 12 championship game? Where do we stop jumping Big 12 teams over Tulane to get that final seed?
After K-State, and the reason I say that is K-State played at Tulane and they won that football game. And I think that should make up for the one extra loss, because you literally played the team on the road and won. It wasn't at K-State. It wasn't at a neutral site. It was on the road, and that I think the committee has proven that they take a lot of stock into that, regardless of when the game happened. I.e., look at last year, Texas over Bama. That is the game. If Texas played UTSA that week instead of Alabama, they would have not have got into the playoff as a 1-loss team last year, I don't think.
100%. They wouldn't have been seated ahead of Alabama in that same right.
So because of that, I think you have to put K-State if they somehow come out of this and win the Big 12. But I don't think you can do Colorado was embarrassed by KU.
Did they not make a
Did you look
stop?
at the box score for that
Yeah,
game?
Devin Neal had like a career game, like over 200 yards total with like
Also,
4
it was
touchdowns.
40 minutes of time of possession to 20, 520 yards for KU to 308 for Colorado, 29 first downs to 15. They almost doubled them up or worse in every single statistical category and
Mhm.
won the game by 16 points. And it was never really competitive
No.
either. KU jumped out to a 17 zip lead. The closest it ever got was 20-14. And then they pulled away after that, and it was never close again. I don't think Colorado should be in the playoff if they somehow come out of this. I do hope. I'm rooting for Arizona State out of this. I don't know how you feel, but I think they're a fun story. I think they're a pretty good football team, and it'd be fun to see a team like that make the first 12 team playoff.
And Jake, let's go ahead and just real quick touch on if Oregon wins the Big Ten, their first year Big Ten in the conference, they win their conference. SMU is locked into the ACC. It's their first year into the ACC. They could possibly win it. Texas could also possibly win the SEC in their first year in the conference. And Arizona State, BYU, Colorado. There are many teams in the Big 12 that have a good chance, but Arizona State currently sits at the best chance to win the Big 12. They are a first-year team within their conference. Could we see with all this conference realignment that we have 4 newcomers win their conference championships?
I would put the percentage of chance of happening at about 10%, if not less.
Yeah.
Probably around 5%, to be honest, because Texas beating Georgia is going to be tough, and they got to get through A&M first to get there. So that's 2 things that have to happen for that to happen. Oregon beating a team twice in the same season is tough.
Very hard
I
to
know
do.
Washington did it to Oregon last year, where Oregon could do it to Ohio State this year, because it feels kind of similar, where we know the books are going to favor Ohio State in that matchup. We know that without a doubt, that will be the case if that matchup does happen. And then on the other side, I think SMU probably has the best chance to do it because they just need to beat Cal. Well, they don't even need to beat Cal. They're in it. So they just would need to beat more than likely Miami. I do think I think Miami is beatable by any team in the country because they have just a horrendous defense. I would probably favor Miami a little bit in that matchup. So it feels like it's unlikely for it to happen in at least 2 of the conferences, more than likely. And so it happening in all 4 seems very unlikely to me.
Yeah. All right, Jake, let's go ahead and move to what the tournament would look like. This is what the bracket currently sits at. And it would be a rematch between Georgia and Tennessee at that 8-9 spot. The winner would go and play Oregon at the Rose Bowl. You've got the 12-5 matchup with Ohio State taking on Arizona State. They would move on and advance. The winner of that game would move on to the Fiesta Bowl, where the Boise State Broncos have had a historic couple of Fiesta Bowls. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. The whole reason why this playoff exists was kind of the inaugural push for that. And then going up to the top left, you're looking at Penn State facing off against SMU at Penn State. They would then travel to the Sugar Bowl to take on Texas. And then the Notre Dame Indiana matchup, both in Indiana, that would actually be a really fun game, kind of maybe a 50. I doubt Notre Dame fans would allow Indiana fans to take over their stadium, but still relatively close game there. Winner take on the Miami Hurricanes. Now, this is all subject to change. These are just projected standings as where they currently sit. Jake, looking at the Texas road to the national championship, I freaking love it. Bring it on. If it could stay like this, Texas is playing in the national championship.
When you look at the top teams that you would consider title favorites in this, the only team that would be pissed off about this is Oregon, ironically. Yeah. You got to run through Georgia or Tennessee to start, then probably Ohio State, and then either a Texas, a Miami, or Notre Dame, whoever comes out of the other side.
Yeah.
At that point, that would be a murderer's row for a 1 seed to have to go through.
See, so here's my argument, Jake. Week in and week out, we've seen the 5 seed with a very favorable matchup. And I know that they're the highest non-bye week conference champion, if you will. But that 5 seed is almost enticing. If you can grab it, you look at a very favorable road, at least to the Final Four.
Yeah, and it kind of brings up the reason that is because these conference champions are guaranteed the top 4 seeds.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost a question of, should they just be guaranteed the playoff, but not the top 4 seed? That's what's gone through my mind, because it just throws too big of there's no reason that, just objectively looking at the format, Ohio State, if they lose to Oregon in the Big Ten title and they get a 5 seed, which is possible, even though it'd be their second loss, it'd be 2 losses to number 1. Mm-hmm. That they would have an easier, objectively easier path to the final than the 1 seed.
It's ridiculous. There's no chance that should happen. Now, I 110,000% agree with you. Again, looking at this first inaugural season, we will take it into consideration, and I think the committee and the NCAA need to look at it very closely and say, we need to make some tweaks. I like the automatic bids. I do. I like automatic bids in terms of making the playoffs, but making those teams the top 4 seeds, there is an objective difference between your SEC Big Ten champion compared to your Big 12 champion or your G5 champion. It just is. There is
especially the G5, especially because you can, we've seen a TCU beat a Michigan. Big 12 still has, a decent amount of blue chip players on the rosters.
Not this season.
Not this year. But when you look at like a Boise State getting a bye because the Big 12's bad this year, or because the ACC's bad this year, it just throws a huge wrench into things, where all of a sudden you're Oregon and you go, we have a bye, but then we got to play Oregon or Tennessee, and Ohio State has to play Arizona State and Boise State. Like, I would rather not have the bye and play Arizona State and then Boise State over have to play one of Georgia or Tennessee, without a doubt.
If you're Oregon, you almost want to tank the Big Ten championship and say, hey, look, I'll take the 5 seed, hand up, give us the 5 if we're going to play the winner of Tennessee or Georgia.
I mean, heck, I think Miami has an easier route than Texas does. I think the 3 is better than the 2 here. I think Penn State and SMU are probably better than Notre Dame and Indiana.
I don't know about Indiana. We saw. What is your take on Indiana, real quick, Jake? After what we saw against Ohio State,
it's tough because their defense actually didn't play that bad. Special teams really hurt them in that game.
Was the dagger.
Ohio State had just a little over 300 yards in that game. The problem is Indiana had 150 yards, and more than half of that came on their first scripted drive. Right. After that, they didn't do anything the rest of the game. And they just got beat at the and if you're getting beat like that, the line of scrimmage, I think even a Notre Dame is going to do the exact same thing to you.
I think I saw a stat. Geez, what was it? I think it was very close to if you took away their 2 scoring drives, I think Indiana had like 6 total yards of offense, or like 26 total yards of offense or something. I mean, it was just stupid low, where they didn't even get hardly a first down on the 2 drives they didn't score a touchdown on. Now, Jake, me personally, I like Texas's road in this scenario, taking on the winner of Penn State or SMU. I think whoever wins that game, I think SMU is limited. I think Penn State also very limited. Penn State, Jake, is they're the Miami of the Big Ten.
I would rather play Penn State than Miami, even just because they don't have a Cam Ward at quarterback. When you're going against Miami, there's still a chance that Cam Ward just goes Michael Penix mode, and it doesn't matter that they don't have a good defense.
I was talking more so they're kind of just skating by. They're playing very close games.
And the comparison, but I think it's worth drawing that distinction of it. It's different when you got to play against a team who has arguably the best quarterback in college football this year, as compared to playing a team who has Drew Aller and a honestly not even as good of a defense as we've seen in years past at Penn State. It's
Yeah.
like their offense is slightly better than it's been in other years, but their defense is a little bit worse. And so I think Penn State's probably a little worse, but they are similar where they're just skating by. They have weak schedules.
Yeah.
Penn State actually has a tougher schedule, Miami, because they at least had to play Ohio State. But I mean, Florida is probably the best team they've played this year.
And
Would
that
you
was
say?
a really bad Florida team.
But
Florida
Florida wasn't
is
good
not.
at the time
That's what I'm
that they
saying.
played them.
Right. Florida was playing their worst football at that point in the season. They've been much improved by that point. So, but yeah, no, you might be right. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I guess Georgia Tech, the team they lost to. Who know?
Yeah. I think one other thing non-playoff related, just I thought was worth mentioning. Mac Brown was let go today from North Carolina.
Okay.
I wasn't sure if you had seen that, but
I saw the murmurs. I saw the kind of things leading up to that being a possibility. I didn't know the news happened tonight. So
yeah, Chris Del Conte. I think if he retires, it's time to build the statue for him outside the stadium. It feels like
I would be in 100% support of
something you want to do while he's still alive. I feel like so you can honor him for what he did for the University of Texas.
Yeah, no, he put them back on the map, brought them back to. He was the first one to get Texas back, and so I will always love Mac Brown for the teams that he put. We grew up watching those teams. Really, the only head coach that I remember being at Texas as a kid was Mac Brown. And so
would he have had more national titles in a college football playoff era? I think probably so.
Maybe
there was a few of those Texas teams that were certainly capable, but dropped one random game, and then with the BCS system, I mean that's when teams truly got screwed.
You had that 3-way tie with Texas Tech and Oklahoma that year.
That year stands out where they lost by a fluke final second play, and
then you go on to beat Ohio State in the Fiesta Bowl, and you end up being a pretty good opponent there for a contender that season. So, but anyway, Jake, that is all the time. Any final comments? Any final opinions? Things that you want to talk about when it comes to this college football playoff?
Just that this year couldn't have turned out any better for my rant earlier in the year about this playoff making more games matter, because there's probably still about 30 plus games that can have some type of effect over the next week. And maybe not quite that many, but probably 10 to 15 games.
I mean, you look at the Big 12,
the Big 12 makes it even crazier with the possibilities there.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's so many games to pay attention to.
If you're including the conference championships the next week, you're probably close to 230. And dude, I mean, heck, if we said any of the top, really from Notre Dame down, loses this upcoming week, their spot is up for grabs in the playoff.
Yeah, I mean, even a Georgia who's clinched their spot in the SEC title game, you lose to Georgia Tech in this for a third loss, all of a sudden you're looking at probably the outside looking in, unless you win the SEC title game. So it feels like we could be in for some more madness this weekend. And more than anything, my final takeaway is I don't think we have much of an idea who the final 12 teams are going to be, other than we probably know about 3 or 4 that are probably locked in. Mm-hmm. And after that, anything's still possible.
And look, Jake, SMU, they're clinched for the ACC championship game. They're not clinched to win the ACC. They go into Cal and they lose that game to Cal. Their playoff chances are done. They are not getting in unless they win that ACC game. But that's an easy overlook your opponent, looking forward to the ACC championship game mindset for these kids. They better be on their A game against Cal, because they need to win that game and still play very well in the ACC championship to have an argument to stay in.
And Cal's one of those tricky teams where all their losses are one possession.
They barely lost to Miami. They gave it to Miami.
They've also barely beat Stanford. They are a weird team because they've had some good wins, but then all their losses are I mean, they lost to Miami by 1. They lost to Pitt by 2. They lost to NC State by 1. And they lost to Syracuse by 8. And they lost to Florida State, which is their worst loss of the year, by 5.
by far. That's a terrible loss.
And SMU hasn't looked unbeatable. They've looked very good, but they have not looked unbeatable. So it feels like we're going to see probably at least one or two really big upsets this weekend that really shake things up. And ironically, it doesn't look like the Texas A&M game has much of an impact on Texas as far as making the playoff goes. So that really wouldn't be one of them. The only question is, could A&M shake things up by winning out and
They'd have to run the table.
Spot?
Yep, they'd have
With
to run
being
the
at
table.
number 20, it feels like they have to win out.
Yeah, and one last comment, Jake. None of the top 12 teams have 3 or more losses, or have 2 or more losses. They are all undefeated, 1 loss or 2 loss teams that are currently sitting in the playoff right now. So the committee is also sticking to their guns about winning your games freaking matters. Having a good record matters.
Yes and no. I putting Bama at 13. That's the one that just really bothers me because they have bad losses.
Them and Ole Miss should not be where they're at. Period.
I
would have Arizona State. I'm just going to put this up one more time. I would have Arizona State ahead of Alabama and Ole Miss. I'd have Arizona State sitting at 13. I might have a BYU sitting at a 14 or 15. And so, yeah, maybe I'll be honest with you. I'd have A&M. As much as I hate ranking A&M higher than 20, I know they just came off of a loss, but I'd at least have them maybe sitting at 18 or 17 around where I think Bama and Ole Miss should be, not ahead of South Carolina.
I'd have them ahead of Tulane. I don't get the fascination with Tulane at all.
I would not have them over South Carolina.
Well, no, they got embarrassed by South Carolina. I'd have South Carolina higher than Ole Miss and Bama. I know they lost to Bama. Head-to-head matters, but they did lose on the road. They lost by, 2 points?
Yeah.
And they don't have any losses that are like a Vanderbilt, or their worst losses, LSU, probably.
Yeah.
They did lose to Ole Miss too, so I guess they're just showing the head-to-head matters.
They're just showing that Bama and Ole Miss beat South Carolina, so South Carolina is ranked behind them.
I would have them ahead of Bama. I'd have
Arizona State ahead of Bama for sure, though, sitting at the 13th spot.
I'd have Bama the last out of those 3 lost teams because it was so close against South Carolina. Ole Miss blew out South Carolina, so I think them being ahead of them would be fine. And then I'd have Arizona State probably at 15, and then I'd probably have Bama at 16. I think 16 is probably 16 to 18 is where Bama should be.
Yeah. No, I agree. And it feels uncomfortable to say that, but their name is Alabama, and that is why they're sitting at 13. That's the only reason why.
Yeah, they've looked inconsistent in wins too. Last thing, sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. We're not going to talk too much more about nationwide things other than our final episode on Friday where we go around the country. And so we wanted to get that out. It's getting very close to college football playoff time. We're excited for it. We wanted to drop this episode because of that. And really what Texas's future holds going into this Texas A&M game and hopefully going in the SEC championship game. I guess one last thing, Jake. I know we keep saying we're done, but I guess
one last thing.
One last thing. We said very early on when we were kind of looking at the format of what the college football playoffs look like is if you miss out or it is better to miss out on the conference championship game if you feel like you've already got a spot than it is to go into a conference championship game and lose and not get the bye week, because then you kind of get that extra week of rest of not playing your conference championship game. That almost has that feeling for Texas right now. Like if we lose, I can look bright side. I can look bright side and spin zone it of saying, well, at least we get a bye week. We're still in the playoffs. We'll have a lower seed. We may not have a home game. It'll be a tougher road to get to the national championship. All those things are true, yes. But I would much rather play in the conference championship and win. Don't twist my words of saying I would rather not have it happen. I would still rather be represented in the SEC championship game and win that game. But again, we kind of had that conversation early in the season.
Yeah, but breaking news: Tanner wants Texas to lose.
Stop!
To Texas
Don't put that. Don't put that out there. No,
I get what you're saying. The fact that it's A&M just means I'm not even going to have this conversation. And you want that bye. At the end of the day, I still think
You
one of the teams with a bye is going to win it all
and
more than likely.
that trumped our conversation. Was at the ultimate end of the day, having that first round bye into the playoffs, not during conference championship week, is much more productive in terms of your team winning a national championship. It's crucial to have that bye if you want your team to have a better chance of winning a national championship.
Yes. Last thing is I would rather also just not put it in the committee's hands, because you still
Absolutely.
are technically putting it in the committee's hands. And
You
maybe
are.
they go, this was Texas's chance to prove it. We're going to drop them out. And
You're right.
you don't put it into people's hands, because at the end of the day, they wouldn't be guaranteed a spot technically, even though we think they more than likely would be in. And so as a team, they're obviously, we as fans can talk about this. I know the team is fully focused on winning that game in
Oh,
College Station.
without a doubt, without a doubt. And so, with all that being said, this is your daily fix for all things Texas Longhorns right here on All In Horns, brought to you by Rogue Sports Network. I'm Tanner Carlson, along with Jake Jimerson. As always, folks, welcome.
All in Sports Network. We love sports.